Okay, so this is the second part of supply and demand, and usually most students actually prefer this part because now we get to see how real life examples can actually impact both prices and quantity of various goods and services. And we could be a little bit creative about this, about trying to anticipate things that can impact different markets. But first, a little bit of a review. So we remember that when we plot supply and demand on a graph, and remember this will show how buyers and sellers will make decisions based on changes in the price of that particular good. So if prices are a little bit higher, then we have a problem. So for this example, if price equals 30, then as you click on this slide, you'll see it's going to intersect the supply curve more to the right than the demand curve, which implies our quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. And the implication of this is that there is only one market clearing price. In this example, it will be price is at 25, and only one market clearing quantity, which in this case is 250. This is the only price where supply equals demand. At every other point in this line, any other price, either buyers are going to be unhappy or sellers are going to be unhappy. The equilibrium price is important because it keeps buyers and sellers equally content. Now, an important question is based on this example, uh, prices cannot change. There's only one equilibrium price, which cannot change. Now, let's think about this for a moment. Is it realistic to think that prices will never change? Are there some scenarios that we think about which might impact prices? So far, these scenarios are not captured in the model as we drew them. So now let's see how we can graph these different situations. And first, one more review. So we have two graphs so far, and we have two different behaviors. So if you actually bring this all up, you'll see different situations. One, what do buyers do when coffee gets too expensive? And the second graph to the right, what do buyers do when there's a new alternative to coffee? So this is very, very important that we have two different behaviors and we graph these different behaviors differently. And this is true just as much for sellers as they are for buyers. So hold on to this. And if we recall, the graph to the left is a change in quantity demanded. It's a movement along the demand curve, and both prices and quantity changes. The graph to the right is going to show a change in demand, a leftward shift or a change in demand. And this happens when quantity demanded decreases while price stays the same. So hold on to these two ideas. We're going to put them both together and the magic is going to happen. And before I kind of dive into some examples, I'm just going to show the four scenarios. And each of these four scenarios, and there are only four, at least for this class. For more advanced classes, there can be different combinations of these four, which makes the analysis a little bit more complicated. But most economic situations can occur with one of these four scenarios. And these four scenarios are going to involve both shifts and movements along the curve. I think it's important to dissect these four scenarios first before we actually apply some meaning to them. And the first is going to be an increase in demand. So for this scenario, we're going to think about things that increase buyers' demand for a product that's not the product getting more affordable. So product is more affordable, that's a movement along the demand curve. Now, we're going to see what are things that can increase demand. And we can think about them. And we will think about some examples about how to increase demand in just a moment. But I'll give you just a couple of ideas. Sometimes cultures change. You know, for a while, Americans loved eating meat. And now veganism, vegetarianism are becoming more popular. So there's going to be cultural changes, cultural shifts that affect demands. The price is not going to change at first. Actually, it's going to be the buyers changing preferences that's going to actually cause price to increase. So let's take a look. And if you click, an increase in demand is going to be a rightward shift in the demand curve. Notice what's happening here is as demand increases, shifts to the right, it's going to put upward pressure on prices. Why is that? Well, imagine this. If a product gets more desirable, can sellers start charging more money for it? Actually, yes. And sellers are also going to be producing more of the products with this increase in demand. So what we're seeing is with an increase in demand, there's also a movement along the supply curve. So the demand curve is shifting to the right, and there's a rightward movement along the demand curve. And if I add my laser pointer, I think that you'll be able to see this. If PowerPoint actually cooperates with me, then you'll see the movement to the right of our demand curve and also movement along this supply curve. And that creates a situation, the first scenario, increase in demand. Now, if increased demand is a movement to the right, then what do you think a decrease in demand is going to be? That's right. It is a leftward shift in the demand curve. So take a moment and just imagine what's going to happen in your minds. And hopefully, you'll see a leftward shift in the demand curve. And notice there's also a leftward movement along the supply curve. So what's happening here? Let's say, let's take veganism as an example. As our culture, as more and more people decide to go vegan or vegetarian, the market for meat products, let's say bacon, is going to shift to the left. Demand, more importantly, is going to shift to the left. And farmers are going to switch production from, let's say, bacon to soybeans. And so there's going to be a leftward movement along the supply curve that proceeds from a leftward shift in the demand curve. Notice also in the last two examples what's happening with price. Actually, changes in price and quantity are the reason for these scenarios. So I didn't actually go through for the last slide for the second scenario, but prices will have actually gone down with a decrease in demand. But now let's move on to supply. And we have two scenarios, and you might have guessed it, an increase in supply or a decrease in supply. Now, usually these increases or decreases in supply come from either changes in technology or changes in the prices of factor inputs. So think, for example, of, well, let's look at, for lack of a better idea, well, let's look at pizza, because I often use that example, because everybody likes pizza. So if pizza dough becomes more expensive, then there might become fewer pizzerias out there. Some pizzerias may just go out of business. Or if the price of alcohol goes up, there might be fewer bars. If the price of wood increases, then the market for cabins or sheds might actually go down as well. So often supply increasing or decreasing involve either the price of factor resources either becoming more or less expensive. Sometimes it's just more or fewer businesses through cultural reasons, and sometimes there's government pressure, but the factor resource is one of the biggest examples. So if we take a look at supply increasing, an increase actually for both supply and demand is going to be a shift to the right. So if supply increases, there's going to be a rightward shift of the supply curve and a rightward movement along the demand curve. Because here's what's actually happening. Whenever supply increases, there's going to be downward pressure on price. And we can think about this conceptually, intuitively. If something becomes more abundant, then it should cost less. If something becomes more abundant, it should cost less. And this downward pressure on prices is going to cause this rightward movement along the demand curve because remember, as something gets more affordable, buyers tend to buy more of it. Notice what happens with price. Price falls and quantity increases with supply increasing. Supply increasing, by the way, is one of the best things that could happen for an economy across the board. Supply increases, things get more affordable, and there becomes more of everything to buy. So we'll think about that. Well, the opposite example is supply decreasing. This is a very bad thing that could happen in economics. And, well, everything is the opposite. There's a leftward shift of the supply curve, a leftward movement along the demand curve because, let's face it, as things get more expensive, people tend to buy less of everything. So notice what happens with price and quantity here. Price goes up when supply decreases, quantity goes down. And you could think about this intuitively as well. As something gets more scarce, it becomes more valuable. So what you may already know intuitively about life, this is how we demonstrate that graphically. And notice also the cause and effects. Something outside of this scenario is causing supply to decrease. Maybe the government imposes a tax on rubber and so there's fewer cars that can be made. Maybe there's a war and the price of oil has gone up and so the price of everything gets more expensive. Something is happening that's causing supply to decrease. And that's going to cause the price level to go up. Some observations that will make your life a lot easier. First of all, this increase in supply or demand are the same direction. So movement to the right is going to be an increase, a movement to the left is going to be a decrease. When demand shifts, quantity supply changes, and when supply shifts, quantity demanded changes. So the shift is going to be the first mover, and then the movement along or the quantity changes is going to be the secondary mover. And that's because both buyers and sellers will react to each other. But in these scenarios that we're about to do, we need to first identify who the primary mover is. And that will be half of the battle of getting these questions right. So now that we saw what this looks like graphically, let's take a look conceptually about what actually causes this. So first, what causes demand shifts? And these are a few. And by the way, this is not an exclusive list, but these are some of the more common points. First of all, changes in wealth or income. Secondly, change in preference. And this usually is cultural changes. Remember, the two of the examples I've used already are cigarette smoking used to be very, very popular. And then all this research came out linking tobacco with cancer. And now very, very few people smoke relatively to in the past. Also, veganism and vegetarianism have seemingly come out of nowhere for the last 10 or so years and have been steadily growing. And the last really important topic are changes in the price of related goods. This is actually a special type of change in preferences. So don't be confused. When the price of related goods change, it's going to cause a change in preference, and that's going to cause one of these demand shifts. And it can either be to the right or to the left. In fact, the price of related goods is so important that this requires a little bit more detail. And there are actually two different types of related goods: complementary goods and substitute goods. Complementary goods you buy together. So in this example, I'm talking about eggs and bacon. And then substitute goods would replace each other. So usually for breakfast, people will buy bacon and eggs together. Or if you don't want bacon and eggs, maybe you'll get bagels. So I'm assuming, and maybe you're weird and you like all three at the same time. You're not weird, actually. There's nothing wrong with you. But some people like all this at the same time. These are assumptions that I'm making to simplify the example. Notice that if eggs become more expensive, I'm going to actually argue that the demand for bacon actually falls, shifts to the left. Likewise, if the price of eggs doubles in price, I'm going to argue that the market for bagels is going to shift to the right, or demand is going to increase for bagels. And again, don't be confused. Prices of related goods, whether they're complementary or substitute goods, is going to have the same effect as general changes in preferences. And that wraps it up for demands, more or less. Again, there are other things that can shift demand, but these are the most common. Now, shifts in supply are going to be caused, and we already talked about a few of these. The most important are the cost of factor inputs. Think parts, labor, raw materials. Also number of businesses, and I mentioned technologies. Now, the last, which is the most important, or I should say the most fun, are other events. Many other events can impact the market for goods and services by impacting the supply curve itself. Some of these I listed here: wars, famines, pandemics, political instability, droughts, etc. Now, again, when doing these scenarios, it's really important first to identify who is being impacted primarily, buyers or sellers. If it's going to be buyers primarily affected by the event, then demand is going to be the one shifting. If sellers are the ones that are most directly impacted by the event, then it's going to be the supply curve that's shifting. For these scenarios, I will only make supply or demand change, not both. And you could thank me later, because it does get a little bit more complicated when both curves shift. But in all of my scenarios, there will either be a supply or demand shift. So either buyers or sellers are going to be the first affected by the scenario. So scenario one, I kept these really simple, hopefully. So meteorologists predict a really rainy spring. How does this impact the market for umbrellas? Well, to me, it sounds like this meteorologist prediction is going to impact the preferences for umbrellas. The price of umbrellas is not changing. So it's not that we're buying more umbrellas because it's becoming more affordable. No, it's not a movement along the demand curve. This prediction is actually should change our preferences for umbrellas. So I believe that the first group that will be impacted by this event will be buyers. It's going to be a shift in demand. And we can see in this example, a rightward shift in demand is going to be an increase in demand. And for this scenario, the price and quantity of umbrellas should increase. With all these scenarios, to get these questions right, you must correctly interpret whether supply or demand is going to increase or decrease, and then you must capture what the resulting change in prices and quantity is going to be in this market. Let's do another example. High wages or taxes have forced the donut factory to downsize, laying off workers. How does this impact the market for donuts? Now, this I think should be a little bit easy. It's going to be impacting a business, so there's going to be a leftward shift in supply. And we model this by a leftward shift, and prices and quantity are going to, well, price is going to be increasing, quantity is going to be decreasing. Now I'll give you some more fun scenarios, and in particular, I'm going to give you plenty of opportunities to work on how prices of related goods are going to impact the market. These are a couple of scenarios that I'll give you a little bit more detail that students typically really enjoy. The first is Chilean wine and the hurricane, and the second is the heroic story of kale, from Pizza Hut decoration to superfood. And I think you're going to enjoy both of these.